Hello, good afternoon. This is Jana from MedTech speaking. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the implications of the medical devices regulation on labeling. And we would foresee about an hour for this webinar, let's say 35 minutes for the presentation that will be kindly given by the chair of our labeling medical devices working group, Christian Podolak, and then about 20 minutes for your questions and answers. You're of course welcome to ask after the presentation directly, or you can also send an instant message on Skype. So I will pass the floor to Christian, and he will walk you through it.
Thank you, Jana. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and a very warm welcome. My name is Christian Podolak, and as Jana outlined, I'm the chair of MedTech Europe's labeling working group for medical devices. So today we're going to take you through the labeling requirements of MDR, and just initial introduction, what that will give you. It will give you a holistic overview about all the labeling requirements. So we try to take everything into consideration from A to Z. However, this is not a technical, detailed presentation where, for example, we would discuss UDI. There are separate UDI groups within MedTech Europe, and I would assume that they would similarly do such webinars. So just scoping that, letting you know. If you, though, have questions, we try to answer that in this webinar here today. If not possible, then we would relay this to the relevant experts and try to ensure that your questions get answered. So welcome once again. And we now dive into the topic of the MDR labeling here. We shortly discuss about the history and the timeline of MDR, and we don't go into much details as the most of you have already extensively heard that from various other conferences. We'll look at the gap assessments, respectively the outcome and the specifics of the MDR today, and then we will tackle the symbol aspect of MDR. That's for sure pending, and we'll give you an update on where that stand, respectively have a short look on implant card, hazardous substances, and we'll also give you a summary, roundup, and some recommendations, what's worth looking into. So let's have a look. I think the most of you have already seen that, and I don't want to go into the too, I would say, technical details. I think what you should know, and this is just to give this presentation a go, is that the MDR started with a planned recast initially in 2008, that this took up momentum with the PIP breast implant scandal. And over the course of the time, as you can see here, there were the various steps of the Commission, Parliament, and Council, and for sure the trialogue and some legal activities resulted then in the official vote and the start of the transition period in 2017. So what we're talking about here today is basically, or is having a date of application, for sure, depending on the soft transition period, as manufacturers may or may not use them with that date of application in May 2020. One important thing you'll see on the lower right-hand side of this slide is that the MDR is a combination of AMDD and MDD together in one set of requirements. And that, you will see later in the presentation, is causing, especially on the sterile barrier, for some new requirements, respectively, symbols that are needed. But we'll talk on that separately. All right, as I mentioned before, bringing this into time axis about the transition period shortly. So entry into force was on May 2017. Date of application will be May 2020, and then there is this so-called soft transition period where there is the possibility to actively use MDD certificates, however, having in mind that those devices are frozen and you are not able to perform significant changes on them. And then for sure, the last but not least, the sell-off period that will basically end 1 year after the certificate void. Certificate void is 2024, and then the stop of the sell-off period is May 2025. So with that having in mind, and with also different timelines for UDI introduction and UDAMED, we'll have a look into the gap assessment that we have performed. So what you can see here basically is the MDR, the outcome of the MDR's gap assessment. You see that this is based off an Excel spreadsheet. So it assessed all the relevant sections of MDRs, not just Annex 1, but also the other clauses of MDR that are having labeling impact. So there is, for example, Article 13, Article 16, Article 20 that deliver separate requirements for that. And overall, this is grouped into the general requirements, requirements for IFU, for labels, for sterile barrier, and for implant card/patient information. What we will focus in today's call is the new requirements. So at the end of the day, the blue bar is what we're looking into, where there is no similar requirement of the MDD. There is, as you can see, requirements that are partially identical, and that's heavily dependent on how the manufacturer is already set up under the MDD. You will get this result of that gap assessment as a part of that slide deck, but we won't discuss that in the slide deck here today. So we'll look into those sections. So 6 elements, new elements in the general requirements, 14 in IFU, 9 in the label area, 2 in the sterile barrier, and 1 in form of a consolidated requirement for patient card and patient implant card and patient information. So we'll start off as you just saw it from left to right, so general requirements first. So you will see there is in total 6 requirements and a very specific requirement. We will focus those that I've just highlighted here, and they are information that is to be provided on the homepage of the manufacturer, a general principle that changed on the information to be provided on the labels. We will have a short look into importer labeling as well as supplemental labeling and repackaging. And then, for sure, a short mention of the impact to promotional material. So let's go through step by step here. So information to be provided on the manufacturer's homepage, that's a requirement you may have already read when you pretty much looked into the chapter 23 of Annex 1. It's one of the first requirements that you really see that pops up there. So if a manufacturer has a website, he needs to make available information that identify the device and any safety and performance related information. So basically, in a nutshell, that means for complete industry, unless they get rid of their homepages, that they have to provide that information. One way of providing such information can be the instructions for use, but must not be. That's an important point I wanted to stress here. There could be different ways of fulfilling that requirements with the homepage itself providing that kind of information. But keep in mind, the management of redundant information that is to be provided about the product is definitely a point, and it's a choice, or it's a choice for each company how to tackle that. But that being said, IFU is just one solution to the problem, if you so will. So looking on to the next one, and I think this is a quite interesting requirement as it changes a bit the principle of the way how information is placed. Let's start off with the initial MDD requirement that comes from Annex 1, Section 13.1. And basically, information that was needed for using the device safely. Till now, you can basically say, I put it on the product. If the product isn't, I would say, sufficient, I'll put it onto the packaging, and if that doesn't work, I put it into the IFU. This principle does no longer exist under MDR, and the principle is simplified, if you so will. And the simplification in that aspect is that the information that is required on the label has to be the label of the product or of the packaging of multiple devices. So whatever basically is listed then in Annex 1, 23.2, that has to be provided on those layers of labeling. The iView, as it was stated in the past, is no longer a feasible option. So what you may consider as part of your MDR activities is that you review your labeling according to those requirements, that you specifically perform a gap assessment according to 23 section 2, and that you ensure that you have all those elements listed on your multiple layers of labeling. That's really key here. Right, very simple and straightforward requirement from MDR Article 13. So the importer is basically to be listed, and the MDR does give a various set of options. So it must not be on the device, or it can be on the device, it can be on the packaging, or basically in documents accompanying the device. So as the MDR is giving a set of options here, the manufacturer can choose. As part of harmonization and I would say work that we have done in the labeling working group, we basically have come to the conclusion that a good option is to place it in the documents accompanying the device. However, this is a soft recommendation, and it's for sure up to the manufacturer to decide whether to use other, I would say, methodologies here as well. It's really dependent, and that's nevertheless an important requirement, because that comes later downstream when the economic operators work together and perform their device inspection. All right, let's move forward, tackling the aspect of supplemental labeling and repackaging. So that's Article 16.3 of MDR. And what that basically says in a nutshell is if economic operator such as distributor or importer carries out activities to provide additional information, basically as listed in Annex 123, or performs repackaging activities as outlined in the previous paragraph of that article, then they need to indicate that they have performed those activities on the labeling, respectively, on documents that go with the device here. So in a nutshell, that's a change of principle of labeling as well under MDR, and that puts more and a stronger focus on that kind of activity. Keep in mind that's here now not for sure not labeling related, but those activities they require in the future quality management system, and registrations, respectively notification, is required for that activity to the competent authority. So what we recommend here basically is an analysis, a very thorough analysis of the pathways, how you import and how you distribute your products. And then if you find in the field of your responsibility that be directly you and or contracted activities, then you need to consider that you have to provide that information. And this is basically what activities had or was carried out, and then the address of that entity that has performed that activity. So keep that in mind, please. The last one here on the general requirements is the requirements coming from Article 20.5. So 20 is the article about CE marking, and there is a small sub-sentence that for some, but not for all members in industry, will have an impact. But most of us I have seen already are doing that in the right direction, and that shouldn't have an impact. But just for the holistic purpose of mentioning that there is a change in the methodology, whenever in the promotional material the CE mark is mentioned, that has to be accompanied by the, I would say, recognition number of the notified body. So the CE mark and the recognition number goes together. As I said, most of industry is already doing that as a good practice, but some don't. So be careful with that requirement. Just keep that in mind, and do not forget that when implementing. All right. What you can see here on this page is this is the outcome of the gap assessment of the instructions for use. we can't, due to the timing aspect here, go for sure through all of them individually. We will discuss in depth a little more about the patient information according to Article 18. However, keep in mind that there is requirements such as system and software requirements if your devices do need them, that there is the clinical benefit required to be articulated in your instructions, that you have to provide links to the safety, to the summary of safety and clinical performance, and one item I want to stress here very much is item number 14, serious incident reporting information. This is a general requirement that will make the most of our IFUs change, and that in a nutshell is information for the user, respectively, for the reader of the instructions for use, to basically know what to report in case of a serious incident, respectively, what to do. And that is a general requirement where all devices fall under, so there is no exclusion about that, and that will make us, at the end of the day, change our instructions for use. So, but let's have a look first into patient information. So there is no similar article from MDD, as you can see here. So what the requirement in a nutshell is that the information that is supplied to the patient has to be provided in the instructions for use as well. So this requirement is listed in section 4 of Article 23. So that means the manufacturer has to provide patient information, and I have it in brackets here also in the instructions for use. So have a careful look how you do provide that patient information. So for implantation or for implants, because when you have I would say a very extensive way of I would say providing that information to the patient, keep that recoupling loop in mind when you touch your instructions for use. So if you have heavy booklets, keep in mind that you mirror those and find the right way how to provide that and how to fulfill that requirement at the end of the day. So that's in a nutshell the summary of the changes around the IFU. So we'll have a look now next onto the labeling. And onto the labeling, we also don't discuss every, I would say, element of that gap assessment. You will have those references here, so you can use that presentation later to dive deeper into if you want, but this is for your reference here. We will have a look at how to label the authorized rep going forward, and we do talk about what you have to give on, or what you need to state about your device, that your device is a medical device. The intention of that is of the regulator to differentiate that away from the aesthetic purpose device so that there is a differentiation possible. Keep in mind there is also other requirements such as the hazardous substances, such as UDI carriers, such as date of manufacture, information if the device was reprocessed, and that there is qualitative and quantitative information for substance-based device. But as said, we can't go extensively through all of them individually. You have the reference, the direct point to what is different, and then you can give it a go on your end. What's important to note, and I think that's almost self-explanatory, but it's always good to have that, I would say, reminding aspect here. When you have a change in classification, the recognition number of the notified body may need to come on your product as well, respectively may need to come on the label of your product. So one example where we could potentially have such update is reusable surgical instruments. So at the moment, they are, I would say, run under Article or Annex 7 basically, and they would undergo a different way of conformity assessment in the future as they are reusable or have that reusable aspect, what the MDR classifies them for a different conformity assessment. So keep that in mind. That is an implication what at the end of the day will alter devices or device labeling too. So now let's have a look into the details here. First of all, starting what the MDD said. So the MDD requirement basically is coming from Annex 1, subsection 13. at the end of the day, you were able to have the authorized rep on the label, the outer pack, or the instructions for use. And that last element, the or instructions for use, that has changed under the MDR. So under the MDR, the requirement basically say information may appear on the packaging for each unit and or the packaging for multiple devices. So that initial principle that we have mentioned under the general requirements does apply here. And that means, in a nutshell, if company uses or are using currently that framework to provide this information via the instructions for use, that will have an implication to them, and they have to think about to move that to the label or to the packaging of each unit and or the packaging of multiple devices. So review your labeling carefully and then adjust the authorized rep information if necessary. All right. The next one that is worth being mentioning, and it sounds like a simple requirement, but we're mentioning it here for a specific cause. So the indication about a device being a medical device, this is the baseline requirement that makes us all our labels change. So unless you have, or basically aesthetic devices are for sure not affected, but they are differently regulated on the other hand side too. So keep that in mind. This is information that you can provide over symbols, and that's a good introduction into the subject. We're coming later. That's I think the biggest precedent case for the need of new symbols. So the requirement where MDR is asking for is also in the subsection 2 of article or of that section 23, and that means an indication that the device is a medical device. And as I mentioned initially, it's there to differentiate away from the aesthetics. So long story short, this principle isn't new. It's something that is used already in IVD industry respectively, where such symbol already exists. So keep that in mind and have that, I would say, as an impact in your, I would say, update on the labels. So the last or the next element on the labeling here is the new requirements for the sterile barrier. And if you remember the chart or the bubbles that I shown before, it's basically coming from the fusion of the AMDD and the MDD. So the AMDD in the past had a section for information to be provided on the sterile barrier, whilst the MDD in itself had just labeling requirements, and therefore most likely we're having here the scenario that we do have those different labeling requirements, and the identification of that sterile barrier, so the first element that you find highlighted here, is also a good case for showing you that there is a requirement or the need for new symbols here. Also keep in mind, we briefly mentioned that on the general labeling gap assessment, there's also the date of manufacture that has to be provided here, but that's just a repetition of a requirement we won't discuss here in more depth. So I'm trying to show you how the MDR requirements or how the different MDR requirements complicate labeling. So this here is a needle. It's basically sterile, packed in a blister, and then we have some more. So this is a single sterile unit, and then there's multiple sterile units here. So, and when you map then the relevant sections of MDR next to those layers, what is the sterile layer here, where you have section 23.3, and where you have the multiple or the general labeling layers, that is 23.2, you can see that there is a duplication of requirements. So a declaration that the device is in a sterile condition and the method of sterilization has to be provided on both. So the good old principle, as you can see from AMDD, to use the sterile EO symbol, for example, to identify the sterile barrier doesn't work, because you have on the general layers of labeling still to provide the methodology of sterilization and its status. So in a nutshell, that means for the requirement 23 3A, an indication permitting the sterile packaging to be recognized as such, there is a new symbol that will basically be required. So just mapping this very carefully according to your layers, keep in mind there is, I would say, some need to change here. So perfect introduction into symbols, and this is in general a very, I would say, difficult topic, but we try to disclose what we can to you and give you a good overview of where we stand, and also give you an overview of what MedTech Europe's plan is to tackle this situation. So there is just, I would say, heads up information up front. There is an ISO project, or there is a project in ISO ongoing to change 15223-1 and add some new symbols to make that, I would say, MDR, ask for symbol, be rolled out. But keep in mind that project is coming not timely for industry. So we're talking about potentially this standard to be available at about, let's say, August 2019. So what we in MedTech have decided is basically to go for an industry guidance to bridge that period. The industry guidance shall be as close as possible to the basically 15223-1 efforts, and the intention is that manufacturers can use the industry guidance for sure with explaining those symbols still, but having in mind that on the long-term perspective, this approach should or will be harmonized. There is a certain, for sure, ifs and whens in that statement, but here shortly outlining to you the path and where we stand at the moment. So we have evaluated the need for symbols in our working group. We have done the risk evaluation of those symbols, so we have classified them according to the 15223-2 standard, and we're about to prepare the validation of those symbols. And as you know, depending on the risk class of the symbols, there is either an associative strength test to be performed, or comprehension, memory testing, and usability testing. So it really depends on what the nature of that symbol is. And our intention is really, as I said initially, very closely aligned to what 15223-1 is doing, and then for sure having that approach validated and covered, so that at the end of the day, that once it's harmonized, that there shouldn't be too much changes for, I would say, the manufacturer. But keep in mind, that's a lot in flux at the moment. So this was for me also very important to deliver you an updated overview of that symbols that are at the moment ongoing and basically likely to be included in the 15223-1 project. Keep in mind that this is a wish list. So this is the 16 symbols overall that have been discussed to potentially be included in the ISO, but it doesn't mean that this comes through as it stands here. If there are hiccups, if there are difficulties, or if there are symbols that create complications where there is, for example, no regulatory requirement, like, let's say, for the distributor symbol, then those symbols may pop out. As I said, adding the word of caution, this is like reading the glass bowl at the moment. We don't know. But here, for your reference, the overview of what has been discussed to potentially include into the ISO standard. So we're talking, and just picking some examples, symbols that contain CMRs or endocrine disruptors, the medical device symbol, symbols that also have been requested from industry, such as single patient reuse symbols, such as an importer symbol, such as nanomaterial symbol, and or symbols that makes it easier for manufacturers to deploy the implant card. So just keep that in mind. We won't go through all of them individually. If there are questions, we for sure have a look into later. What I have for you here, and once again, we share what we can, but we can't predict the future very exactly. This is some examples for symbols that will come. So we have here 2 proposals for a medical device symbol. the likelihood that the right one will make it, we can't say much about it, though. It's one or the other, most likely, as the medical or the MD in a box doesn't fulfill all the criteria of the development process. It's more likely the left than the right. I've seen some people already, or talked with, I would say, solution providers that already market the symbol as medical device symbol to be coming. Be careful with that. There is, as said, careful, the word of caution. For sure, every manufacturer can do their own symbols and explain them in their instructions for use, but keep in mind, at the end of the day, this could or could not be a harmonized symbol. Here are examples for the single patient reuse, medicinal substance, or the distributor. As said, this is draft symbols, but that's the current state of play, if you so will. Going forward, covering the last pillar of that gap assessment. So if you see the bottom chart, the very right-hand side, I would say information on the implant card and the patient information, there is simply a small subset of requirements to be fulfilled. The implant card has to list device name, serial number, lot number, UDI, device model, name and address of the manufacturer, website of the manufacturer, and space to enter the patient information, the patient details basically, and the information that has to be provided to the patient is basically warnings and precautions to be taken here, the expected lifetime statements and other information that a patient would require for safe use of the device. So when we basically bring an example here, what is required, for example, for safe use, limitations of activities when people have implants, like when they have knee implants or when they have cardiovascular implants. So keep that in mind. That's to be shared and that's to be provided to the patient at the end of the day. And going back and closing the loop, to be mirrored as well in the instructions for use. What is exempted from that, basically, or from that implant card approach is for sure the usual suspects here that are listed in various sections of the MDR. So sutures, staples, dental finning, braces, crowns, and so on. So that's a common set of devices that do not need to fulfill those requirements. All right, let's move on. The last but not least is also a very interesting set of requirements here. We have to talk about hazardous substances. So what are hazardous substances? It's CMR or endocrine disruptors of category 1A or 1B, basically coming from REACH, CLP, or Biocid directive. So, and if they are over a threshold of 0.1%, means weight percent, then that has to be considered. So there is an aspect of the patient contact. So the mode here is basically they have to be invasive and come in direct contact with the body, and they have to basically touch medicines, body liquids, or other substances such as gases, for example, and they shall administer or re-administer or transport and store those. So these two factors, I would say as a baseline, what it tackles here, keep that in mind that you have to label those substances, and the substance information shall be labeled on the product and or on the pack unit, on the unit pack or the multi-pack, basically. What at the end of the day is necessary if you do have devices that have or that overshoot that threshold, basically, you have to justify that use of that substance. And keep in mind that the criterions listed in that section, I think it's 10.4.5 of Annex 1, are quite tricky. So you have to take into account in your justification the analysis or how the patient is exposed, or the user. You have to analyze if there are alternatives available. And then, in a nutshell, you have to justify why the other materials, if there are alternatives, won't solve your problem. So making or considering then also scientific committee guidelines, such as guidelines that will be coming forth delayed, such as DHP, So keep that in mind. That's part of the justification. Even if you internally can justify the first three bullets, if the skinnier guideline says at the end of the day, for example, DHP is no longer good, that's it on the justification. So it's for sure not banned, but it's a ban, or it's a potential for a ban over justification. So keep that in mind. And I strongly recommend you start this activity as early as possible in your process. So, rounding this up here, what's the key takeaway message is all labels do require an update. So there is new symbols and new requirements for coming from MDR that make us change our labels. There is additional information to be provided. A potential way of providing such information is providing the IFUs on the manufacturer's homepage. Much likely all IFUs have to be reworked because of that requirement, what I mentioned initially, that there has to be some information about serious incident reporting. And there is overall, if you want to summarize the intent of the MDR, a stronger focus on consistency of risk management to labeling. I think the most of us are already really good on that they have a strong traceability and a strong, I would say, execution of risk management. But keep that in mind if that's still a focus area for you. MDR is thinking about that. So what do we recommend? A strong recommendation is that you evaluate existing labeling infrastructure. So can your printers, can your templates, are they all capable for those new symbols, or are they capable to print UDI? So if your infrastructure doesn't allow that, start as early as possible in the process to replace those, to validate those, and to set the stage for the new MDR requirements. Also, what I strongly recommend is that you start early. The earlier the better, when suppliers are involved or other stakeholders from different departments. As I mentioned before, hazardous substances, for example, is the predicate scenario where you may not be client A for your supplier, and that information delivery takes longer than you expect. So wherever other stakeholders, such as suppliers, are involved, keep that in mind. Evaluate the timing and impact of other label changes, such as potentially Brexit. That's on itself is a topic on its own, but just mentioning here for the holistic purpose. And then evaluate early as early as it's possible for you the international impact of changes on labeling. So when you add the notified body number, or when you add new symbols, that may trigger some activities in certain countries. As said, there is a lot of communication work to be done in that aspect, and that may or may not impact your registrations. So keep that in mind. Want to thank you for your attention. I think we're running quite good on time. So happy to hear some questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Christian. I just wanted to make everybody aware that the webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to consult it afterwards, and we'll also share a PDF of the presentation so everybody knows. And yes, if there are any questions, I can unmute the participants and you can ask your questions. If you have a question, please state your name and your company.
Hello, this is William Kinsman from supporting KCI. There was a symbol that you had showing the sterile packaging, which actually was a red triangle. Does that need to be published in red? That's the one.
Christian?
myself again. I'm very sorry for that. So it was a quite long monologue, and I was waiting for some other questions. Sorry for that. So forgive me that I displayed that here in that, I would say, method. It's just an indicator that there is something missing. So the triangle, the red triangle, and the exclamation mark is for sure not the symbol that shall be used here. So that's just more of a warning heads up here. There is a missing element here just to highlight on the presentation. So it's not meant to be a symbol on its own. The proposals, as I said, and that's all proposals at the moment, that have been put forward into the ISA process are proposals from the Sterile Barrier Association. And if you want to get a flavor for how those proposals could look like, you can search the internet for, I think they have published that on their website as well. So that should give you a flavor of what could potentially come out of the ISA process. I hope that clarifies it.
Are there any other questions?
This is Peter Bøge from Novo Nordisk. I have a question regarding the human body contact and the hazardous substances. Do you read the human body contact as being in contact with skin, or is it to be read as contact with the body via a needle, for instance, or similar?
So it's a twofold criterion here. They are invasive and come in direct contact with the human body. So it's an and connection. So if they are invasive and they come in contact, that's what they have to, in a nutshell, fulfill here. So if they are just coming in contact, but they wouldn't be invasive, just one of the two criterions would be fulfilled. So means if they're just, I would say, top level contact, like let's maybe pick a drape or whatnot, and they are not contacting injured skin, if you so will, so then that may be look different than for those devices. Thanks for your question.
Hello, this is Nicholas Baker here from Zimmer Biomet. I just had a question about when the industry recommendations for the symbols will be provided, or is there a target date yet other than August 2019 for the ISO update?
So what we're trying to achieve is that the industry guidance from MedTech Europe is available like early 2019. So we haven't done, I would say, the full assessment of how long will the validations take, how many members will support us here in that instance. So I would carefully say Q1 calendar year 2019, the industry guidance will be available, and then August 2019, the basically this standard of the standard will be available. As said, ballpark around that time frame, and this standard means not the final standard, but a platform to work off at the end of the day for industry.
That means we have to do.
If there are no questions right now, we have some questions in the instant message box. So, do we know if notified bodies who move out of the UK because of Brexit can have acceptance deals with the European Commission and member states that no changes in labeling and IFU need to be made? I would say that that's another thing that is not quite so clear yet. But please, Christian, if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think you already added the word of caution here. I think nobody exactly knows what the notified body will be doing here. But let's try to analyze or break down Brexit into two different aspects. So you have, first of all, the notified body aspect on your label. What is the notified body recognition number? And then secondarily, you may or may not have an authorized rep that is being based in the UK. So those two topics, they are of a different nature. So now, for sure, nobody knows how Brexit will go and how or if there is a mutual recognition or not. But let's sort of try to read the glass ball here. What could happen is, and that is to, I think at the end of the day, you need to contact your notified body for their plans. So the most of the notified bodies, or the biggest notified bodies, they do have their backup plans. So like BSI and SGS, they do have, or they're opening up facilities in the Netherlands, being BSI in Amsterdam, and I think it's for SGS, it's in Antwerp in Belgium. And when they register that notified body in the EU27, that is very, very, very likely a new recognition number. So there will be an aspect of the label change here. So that, for sure, considering the hard Brexit. What you have to keep in mind is then, as like, what will happen and how will your notified body transfer that? So the transfer from A, UK to B, the EU27 country, is basically internal notified body mechanics, and it depends on if you get a certificate issued from the EU body before or after the Brexit. So assuming you will get it before the Brexit, then you have a certificate. You basically are in the framework of previous MBOK guidance papers, approaches for changing a notified body, and regular, I would say, periods that are listed in that MBOK document could apply. Keep that in mind. If your notified body won't issue because of resources, because of timing, because of listing problems, that's a different story that you may need to address in a different perspective, so to say. Coming now to the secondary aspect of Brexit, what is authorized rep? And as said, all of that, for sure, nobody knows how Brexit will go. But the authorized rep is something where you haven't got the luxury of a notified body transfer guidance approach. So then this basically instantly is required at the point of Brexit. So that's where you have to basically work out solutions, how the information could be forwarded basically from the initial authorized rep to a EU27 authorized rep. So by the hard date of Brexit, at the end of the day, you have to have a EU27 rep, and that rep to be registered basically in the respective country databases. So that you can't, I would say, snap your finger and have all your labels instantly updated. That's for sure given, and there is separate methodologies how you could go about it. In a nutshell, you could think about overlabeling, having in your DC sticking additional addresses on, and or work out different solutions with your notified body at the end of the day, and or competent authority in that instance. But as said, that's really reading the glass ball, predicting what likely could happen, but we don't know yet. And there are separate efforts going on to work out potentially guidance documents on that, but that's not final at this point in time.
Thank you, Christian. So there are further questions in the instant messaging box, and I think we still have a few minutes. So 23.2 requires a quantitative and qualitative description, while quantitative is straightforward. What is your understanding of the type of information to meet the qualitative expectation?
That's a very good question. we haven't in the MedTech Europe group looked into this detail, to be very frank with you. I couldn't come up here with a, I would say, default recommendation what you should do here. I think the general methodology or recommendation I could give you is prepare a proposal and go reach out to your notified body. Your notified body is your partner for sure. They cannot, I would say, give I would say, consulting or help you guide through and whatnot. But if you have a good relationship, you could come up with a proposal and have them giving you a thumbs up or a thumbs down for your approach. So we from MedTech Europe haven't on our own worked ourselves out a methodology here. So I would recommend you talk with a notified body on that.
Thank you. And we have another question. How can I obtain the leading candidates for the 16 areas in which symbols are needed? I believe I could also answer that. So please note that these are not final yet. And we can, of course, share them, but they are not harmonized symbols yet. I don't know if you want to add anything here, Christian.
Absolutely. I think what we have to be careful about is this is, at the end of the day, this is something you can easily join and access over your standardization organization. So if you basically are reaching out over, let that be your DIN, BSI, and or Swiss organization, you can participate in that standardization activity. So then you instantly get direct access. We will, as part of our activities with the industry guidance, we'll develop and publish such I would say guidance, but with that I would say timeline that we have mentioned before. And also, I think adding on top to what Jana said, at the moment this is just I would say drafts. It's not sure if they will make it, if those symbols will pass validation. So that's the caveat we have to add here at the current stage in time.
Thank you for that. I think this is all of the questions that I'm seeing in the messaging box. Are there perhaps any other last questions as we are getting closer towards the end of the webinar? There's one. 23.2 requires warnings or precautions to be taken that need to be brought to the immediate attention of the user of the device. Any guidance? Yeah.
Yes, that's a question that we already have received up front, I think, by a different person. So in a nutshell, the answer to that question is your risk management. So your risk management will ultimately define if there is, I would say, warnings that require immediate attention. So have you run through your device risk management and the ones that result in or that have a high combination or that have a combination of a high likelihood and a strong severity are the ones to consider. So have a review of your risk management file, and that's what I have mentioned as well in the summary. There is a stronger focus from the MDR on consistency, and that requirement is one facet, so to say, of that consistency approach from risk management towards labeling.
Thank you. I'm not sure if there are any further clarifications, comments, questions.
This is Novo Nordisk, Peter Bøge. One question regarding information to be put on the sterile packaging. Have you discussed the issue that some sterile packagings are so small that it's very close to being impossible to put some of this information on, and whether the law makes any room for doing other things, such as putting on a second layer or multi-pack or similar?
Absolutely. That's a very good question, and I'm trying to find the relevant section here for you. Bear with me 1 second. So it's in the general principles that we have had a look on. So basically, information required on the label shall be provided on the device itself. So if this is not practicable or appropriate, some or all of the information may appear on the packaging for each unit and or the packaging of multiple devices. So the MDR does still offer the option to move that information. The only caveat to that is what I have mentioned. It's no longer the instructions for use that could potentially carry that. So the answer to your question is is Annex 123(1)B, where that I would say exemption or that space limitation problem is discussed / being resolved.
And this also covers the information to be put on sterile packaging, sterile barrier packaging.
So the sterile barrier is just a different form of your label, and that's how I would take that requirement. So at the end of the day, it's labeling, and that's how I would read and interpret this requirement. For sure, that's no, I would say, robust and firm assessment from a lawyer, but the most of the MDR stuff is basically you have to set your stake in the ground, and come up with a justification and a position for that, and document that, and demonstrate the absence of risk, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of what matters and what matters not. So you have to review, and also doing the risk-based approach from your risk management file perspective. What's the core information you have to provide on that? What is really essential, and what can move to other layers? And that principle applies to all labeling. So it's in the general section 23.1. Hope that clarifies it. Just see the question, will you be sharing the slides? That's the intention. We are having planned to share a PDF of that slide deck that you have reviewed or that we have reviewed together with you here today. So you will find in this slide deck, and that's what I wanted to mention as well, you will find all those references to where the new requirements are. So it's a really helpful and handy tool if you want to use it that way, to find out where potential risks and weaknesses are of your devices. And then at the end of the day, you will also find some backup information where there is what I called initially partially identical sections from MDR to MDD. So they are filtered and provided for you in the, I would say, appendix as well. And that in a nutshell, I think gives you a very, very good overview of where MDR and MDD are different. As I said, here in that instance, it's really depending on the company's setup and the way how they do their labeling. Some of that may just be an element of text being different, but not having a practical impact. But keep that in mind. Those sections are listed for you, and we will be definitely sharing those slides with you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for that. I think that was an excellent conclusion of our webinar. Indeed, we'll be sharing the slides and the recording. And I think we just reached the time that we foresaw for this webinar. So thank you very much all for participating. And thank you, Christian, for giving such an excellent overview on the labeling.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.